Welcome to the screencast, Structuring and Writing a Thesis. This is part 3 of 3, Methods, Results, and Discussion. First, let's go over the learning outcomes for part 3 of this presentation. By the end of it, you should be able to write a methods section that is appropriate for your discipline, write a results section that clearly and logically presents your findings, and write a discussion section that places your findings in the context of the literature. And here's a brief overview of the presentation. We'll start by discussing the methods section, then we'll move on to the results section, and we'll spend the last part of the screencast on the discussion section. Methodology. Well, of course, the methods section or the methodology section describes the methods or models used in your research, and it may include the following: subjects or participants, materials, instrumentation and apparatus, location, sampling technique, data collection procedures, and data analysis procedures. And of course, the contents of the method section really depends on your discipline, but all methodology sections will have data collection procedures and data analysis procedures. The thing about method sections is that they have huge discipline-specific variation. So there's really not that much we can say that will cover all method sections. For example, some method sections may be very short with no subheadings, and they may rely largely on referring to established methods in the field. And in this type of method section, there are usually few justifications for the methods selected. Then at the other extreme, the method section may be quite long with many subheadings and levels of heading and justifications for the choices made. And of course, then there are lots of method sections for different disciplines that would sort of fall in the middle of those two extremes. So the best way to determine what kind of method section you need to write for your thesis is to consult other method sections from theses that have already been written in your discipline. And most departments have awards for winning dissertations and theses. So I would look these up, and you can always ask your supervisor for recommendations of method sections that he or she suggests that you follow. But there are a few things you can do no matter what kind of method section that you are writing. One is to link the methods with your research questions, your objectives, or hypotheses. So don't leave this up to the reader. Give them some guidance by making these connections explicit. Another thing you can do is to begin your method section with an overview of the underpinning approach and general description of your design. And it's also a good idea, as I mentioned in part 1 of this screencast, to include a summary at the end of your method section. And in fact, you should really do that for each section of your thesis. Start with an introduction and finish with a brief summary. This kind of framing, if you like, of the sections of your thesis will lend to it an aura of professionalism. So most methodology sections, although not all, justify the reasons for choosing the methods and link the methods back to the literature. Now, sometimes the justifications are made in the results section, but usually in the method section. And another thing most method sections do is address potential biases and other limitations with the methods. Here I have a sample extract from a method section from a student's proposal. And it's quite skillfully done. And the reason that I particularly like this method section, the reason why I chose it, is because she's very explicitly linked her methodology with her objectives, even to the point of having a heading to that effect. Here, methodology matched to objectives. And then in the subheading beneath, she has her first objective. She's already, of course, listed her objectives in the introduction, but she's repeated them here, starting with objective 1, to determine hydraulic properties during snowmelt infiltration. That was the objective. And then here's the method. By conducting and analyzing field-based observations of snowmelt infiltration. So I'm going to read the detailed part of this paragraph. To accomplish this objective, it is critical to understand snowmelt infiltration under different types of land cover and soil. Observations of snowmelt infiltration will be made at 6 field sites in Old Jack Pine Boreal Forest and 6 in the Saint-Denis National Wildlife Area. See Figure 4.8 for the location of these sites. Each site has different soil properties. Table 4.7 contains a description of these 12 types of soil properties. The observations will be analyzed to determine how the melting snowpack is partitioned between runoff and infiltration. This analysis will include the following: determination of soil water storage relative to the snowpack under different land covers and in different types of soil, analysis of the pattern of the 0-degree isotherm to determine the frozen soil depth, and assessment of the water table response to snowmelt. I didn't include every sentence or every complete sentence here, as you can see by the ellipses. So as you can see, the paragraph gave the details of the method that is used to carry out objective 1. I'm going to move on now to the results section. So what do we do in a results section? Well, you present your data and their statistical treatment, and in doing that, you need to follow the conventions for presenting statistics in your field. And you should present your findings in a logical order. Usually this is in the order in which you presented your research questions, objectives, and hypotheses. And if you organize your method section in the same way, then the reader will find it much easier to follow your thesis. And then results section contain the bulk of the visuals in a thesis, so tables and figures. And you use these, of course, to highlight your key results. And in putting in your tables and your figures, you need to follow disciplinary guidelines for headings, for example, for source lines. And make sure that you refer to the table or the figure in the text and direct the reader to the table or figure before you actually present the table and figure. And then use the text to highlight the story the visuals tell. So pick something out of the visuals that you want the reader to focus on. Cohn and Foster have written a really an excellent book called Dissertations and Theses from Start to Finish. And they had a great suggestion, I thought, which was to do a mock-up of your results section at the proposal stage. So you may say, yes, but I won't have any results. Of course you won't. But doing this will help you to create a framework for the results section. And to do this, you should read other results sections to see how they're organized, just to get a sense of what your framework will look like. And another good suggestion that these authors have is to, when you're presenting your findings, state the finding first, followed by the data and statistical analysis. Don't lead with the data and statistical analysis. Lead with the finding. And this is an example from that book, from Cohn and Foster, of what they mean. Here's how not to do it, the first one. Table 11.1 shows that the means for boys for all 3 games involving such activity are significantly higher than for girls. Main effect for gender, 1,59 equals 4.62, p is less than 0.05. So you can see here that this finding, or this isn't really the finding, this it leads with the analysis, as opposed to the better way of doing it, where the finding comes first, as in this example. Boys were found to spend more time in types of play involving large muscle activity. This can be seen in Table 11.1, in which the means for boys for all 3 games involving such activity are significantly higher than for girls. Main effect for gender, 1,59 equals 4.62, p is less than 0.05. So it's quite clear, isn't it, that it's much easier to read and to understand the significance of the finding when it's presented this way than when it's presented this way and we don't really know what the finding is. These same authors had some other really, really good advice about writing out results, and I wanted to quote from their book. A good rule to follow is to be monotonously repetitive. Decide on a particular sentence structure that most clearly presents the results of a particular type and stick with that structure for all results that are similar. For example, if you discuss data for females first for the first dependent variable, discuss them first for all the rest. Consistency and symmetry will aid your reader greatly in understanding your results. The reader will follow your presentation more easily if you minimize variety in sentence structure and write clearly and concisely. So this, I thought, was an excellent piece of advice. Readers follow prose more easily if consistent sentence structure is used. And this is especially true when presenting something like findings, that you really want the reader to be able to follow your logic. I'm going to go on now and talk about interpretations. Well, how much interpretation should you include in the results section? And I'm going to quote from some other authors here. They say that reducing the data and highlighting specific cases are all highly interpretive processes. We don't let the data speak for themselves in research reports. In summarizing our results, we interpret them for the reader. So what they're saying is that there's no such thing as writing an objective results section that has no interpretations. Just the very act of writing a results section is going to be an interpretive process, because you are selecting the data, reducing and selecting the data that you want your readers to focus on. So there has to be interpretation in the results section. Of course, there may not be as much interpretation, and it may be carried out a little bit differently. It may not be carried out, for example, in a comparative fashion, the way it is in a discussion section, which we'll talk about in a minute. Here's a little bit more about results sections and interpretations. These are the findings from a study of the results section of 20 biochemistry research papers. And the author found the following: that 95% of these research papers included interpretations, 95% justified the methods used, and 55% indicated agreement or disagreement with other research findings. So you can see here that then 95% is a very high percentage. That is pretty well impossible to write a results section and not include interpretations. And although most of your comparative comparisons with previous research results may be in the discussion section, this indicates here this finding that 55% of agreement or disagreement actually occurs in the results section. So now let's talk about the discussion section. I'm going to spend the most time on it because it's probably the most critical part of your thesis. Why is it so critical? Well, it's in this part of the thesis that you really show your ability to reflect, to critique, and interpret what you've done, and to place your literature to replace your thesis your results in the context of the literature. And here's what Swales and Feek had to say about discussion sections. They say that the discussion section is typically more theoretical, more abstract, more general, more integrated with the field, more connected to the real world, and more concerned with the implications or applications than the results section. It is also more likely to discuss the limitations of the study. But all of that said, it's important to note that there's also much disciplinary variation in discussion sections. So while what they're saying here is true in most cases, there are going to be some differences. And of course, as we saw in part one, there are many, in many theses, the results and discussion sections are actually combined. So there are these differences. So the discussion section is critical, as I've just said. Why? Because it's here that you critically analyze and interpret your findings, as I've also just said, in the context of the literature. And not only that, but within the framework of your questions, objectives, and hypotheses. And so most discussion sections actually start with reiterating the main purpose of the research, or reiterating the research questions or objectives. And then they're organized by major finding or hypothesis. And others' findings and interpretations are integrated into the discussion of each finding. And of course, you're also going to include possible explanations about the findings, and explanations of, especially if perhaps your findings differ from other people's findings. And then you also need to include unexpected findings, and with possible explanations for these. And most discussion sections also discuss limitations in the research, usually in a separate section within the discussion section. And then implications are also usually discussed, and these are generalized from the results themselves. And then nearer to the end of the discussion section is a section on ideas for future research, and also in some disciplines, practical applications. And in a manuscript-style thesis, you'll find that ideas for future research are often discussed at the end of an individual manuscript, in the discussion section of an individual manuscript, and then that future research is the topic for the next manuscript. And as I've already said, a really central role of the discussion is to place your findings in context, in the context of the literature, and to explain how your findings compare with those of other studies. Do they concur with, or do they contradict previous findings? Do they extend them? And your own findings might actually help you to explain or clarify contradictions in the literature. What do you do if your findings contradict other people's findings? Well, you should look to your methods section. Perhaps different measures, procedures, or sampling biases account for these differences. And you have to think about, what do these differences say about the generalizability of your findings and others' findings. And finally, you need to address how your study contributes to the literature. Don't let the readers try to find this out for themselves. You need to point them in the right direction. You need to be explicit. Here I have a sample extract from a discussion section of a thesis, and I'd like to read this out to you. This hypothesis expected similar patterns to exist between phonological processing and reading abilities in Chinese. However, the correlations between these tasks did not achieve significance, and relationships were not demonstrated in the current study. Other studies have shown that Chinese reading is composed of phonological processing. So to suggest reading in Chinese and phonological processing are not related would dispute the evidence already published on the subject. There are several possible explanations for not finding the expected relationships among the Chinese tasks. One explanation may be found in the relatively limited number of participants in the sample. The funding issue is also an impediment to a broader participant pool. Lastly, the student base from which to draw volunteers was essentially exhausted. All students who initially volunteered for the study were accommodated, and no others were forthcoming as the testing concluded. So you can see here that this student had to deal with writing a discussion section about her research in which her hypothesis was not supported by her study. So she had to figure out the reasons why. And so you can see here that she's said here, I expected to find similar patterns that other researchers have found. But in my study, these relationships were not demonstrated. And then she goes on and she talks about what the other studies found. And then she gives the explanations for why this may be. And she points immediately to her methods, that she didn't have very many participants, and there was a funding issue, and the student base was small. And so you see how she's, instead of perhaps, she hasn't critiqued the other studies, as she might have done that if she really felt there was something inadequate about them. But she's been honest about the weaknesses, shortcomings of her own study, which perhaps are the reasons for why she could not support the hypothesis. So I think this is actually a very good extract from a discussion section. So, and you can see from looking at that a key role of the discussion section is to concede limitations, okay? And there are usually two categories that these fall into, and you could see one of these at least at work in the extract. One category is decisions made about the research and unforeseen roadblocks. Well, really the problems that this student uncovered in the extract really, I suppose, fall into both, but really number one, she didn't have enough participants, and that was one of the reasons why she wasn't able to support the hypothesis. And see how she's been honest, and this is what you need to do. You need to be honest about how these decisions and difficulties may have affected your findings, just as she was. And most discussion sections end with a brief discussion of additional areas for research. Here are a few tips for writing your discussion section. Don't wait until the very end to write your discussion section. Be thinking about it all along. Jot down notes while you're doing your experiments, you're doing your research, you're gathering your data, you're analyzing your data and your results, and you're reading a literature. Jot down notes and think about how your discussion section is going to unfold. Reread the proposal and sections of the thesis, especially the literature review, in preparation for writing your discussion. Make sure you're current with the literature and avoid simply repeating your results. Analyze, interpret, synthesize, and critique. Another thing is to anticipate your readers' responses. Make your arguments, make your claims, but don't ignore counter-arguments, other points of view, competing explanations. And make sure that you do insert concessions. You're conceding things, just as we saw the student do in that extract. And if appropriate, that you're refuting or rebutting other people's claims. Pay attention to how strong you are in your own claims, and be careful of implying causation when it doesn't exist or it doesn't appear to exist. So instead of writing, write was associated with instead of caused, for example. Just to sum up this part 3 of the screencast. Link your methods with the research questions, objectives, or hypotheses. Be grammatically and logically consistent in your presentation of results. Begin paragraphs with a finding rather than a statistical treatment. Be aware that results sections do include interpretations. In your discussion section, give a deeper interpretation of your results, comparing them with others' results, providing possible explanations for similarities and differences, and showing how your research advances the field.